everyone, we're here at the Canberra Environment Centre in the Food Waste Education Hub. This is Zoe and I'm Ryan, and today we're going to talk to you about composting and worm farming.
That's right. So we're going to talk first about composting, then about worm farming. We've put together a guide about how to make it really easy for you to compost or worm farm in Canberra in your backyard or balcony. And we're also going to answer some of the most commonly asked questions that we get about composting and worm farming in Canberra.
Now, why would you want to start composting or worm farming? There's two main reasons. The first is that the finished product makes a great organic fertiliser for your garden. And the second is that when we send our food scraps to landfill, they break down surrounded by plastic, which releases methane, a dangerous greenhouse gas.
That's right. Now, you might be wondering about the difference between composting and worm farming. Compost uses microorganisms and bacteria from the soil to break down your food scraps into something wonderful that you can put on your garden. Worm farming is actually really similar, except it uses a special type of worm, which is a composting worm, to do the job for you. So while compost is more like having a bin in your garden, worm farming is more like having a pet. All right, so right here we've got the 4 different elements that you need to think about when you're making a backyard compost. So over here we've got nitrogen, and here we've got carbon, and this is air, and this is water over here. So can you tell us about nitrogen, Ryan?
Yeah, nitrogen is going to be made up of the kitchen waste that you take out to your compost. So we've got some leftover capsicum here, some fruit scraps. You can put tea bags in as a source of nitrogen. A little bit of coffee's okay. Also your grass clippings, any green waste from the garden, and even the dust in your vacuum cleaner can act as a source of nitrogen from your compost. So that's kind of the green and colour that you're adding in to go with your browns.
So when we talk about browns or carbon, we're talking about a few different things, pretty much things that you can find around your home or garden. So we've got straw, we've got dead, dry autumn leaves over here, and shredded paper is also a great source of carbon. You can also add things like torn up bits of cardboard, scrunched up paper bags or paper towels or egg cartons, and you're wanting to add those in a sort of 50-50 ratio in terms of volume. Pretty much every time you're adding nitrogen, you want to add carbon.
That's right, and so just like you and me, the microbes that are in our compost need water to be able to do their job properly. And so normally the food scraps will add enough moisture to your compost that you don't need to do anything, but in the heat of summer, you might find that your compost pile dries out, in which case you'll want to add a watering can full of water to the mix. Good way to test if that needs to happen is to just have a feel around in there. If there is moisture, don't do anything. If it's bone dry, go and grab your watering can.
Now, the final element that we're talking about today is air. This bowl is empty because it's already full of oxygen, and just like this bowl, we want to add oxygen to our compost. The microorganisms that live in compost are alive. They need oxygen to breathe, just like you and me, and there's a couple of ways you can make sure that your compost pile has the air that it needs. You can just stick a fork in it and move it around, or if you're keen, you can get in there and turn it over every once in a while. You can also make sure that the carbon elements that you add, the straw or the paper, are nice and dry, because inside the bits of carbon there's going to be lots of oxygen there to help mix it all up.
If you combine all of these elements after 3 to 6 months, you should end up with some nice rich compost like this that you can add to the garden, which we're going to show you now how to make.
So one really common way of composting in Canberra is using one of these black bins. So you just put the food scraps in like this at the top. Now it's open to the bottom, as you can see down here. And that's so that the worms and microorganisms can travel up from the soil into your compost and do all of that good work for you. There's a couple of ways you can turn the compost to add oxygen. So the first way is using a fork, like this. And the second way is with a compost stirrer. So you just put it in like this and turn it around, lift it up, adding oxygen. And you can do the same thing with a fork. So just putting it in like that and turning it around. So a couple of really simple ways of adding oxygen to your compost. The great thing about these open bottom compost bins is they're really easy to empty. All you need to do is lift it off like this and put it to the side, and then you can shovel the compost back in like this and it's very easy to separate out any finished compost from the bottom to put on your garden.
I'm going to show you how to do open bay composting, which is the simplest type of composting. All you need is a quiet corner in your backyard and a simple 3-walled structure. We've used recycled pallets, which do the job just fine and are really easy to get your hands on. So what I'm going to do is add my nitrogen materials. Here I've got some grass clippings and some weeds from the garden. And I'm going to put the same amount of carbon materials, which in this case we've got straw and some autumn leaves. We're going to mix those together, and it's as simple as that. Here's an open bay compost that's been sitting for about 6 months, and I'm going to show you how to make sure you get oxygen through the pile so you'll end up with some beautiful compost. So important to get the bottom, take it up to the top, like that. And as you can see, we're starting to get that nice rich compost underneath. And because we're in Canberra where we have really cold winters and hot summers, you want to cover your open bay with a piece of shade cloth or some tarp to make sure you keep the moisture in there in summer and the heat in there in winter. Now this cover is also going to make sure that your pets or any other animals or birds don't get into your compost, and you'll be on your way.
What should I do if my compost is just too slow, if I'm putting in the food scraps but it's not breaking down?
So if your compost isn't breaking down, it's usually an indication that you've got too many carbon materials in the mix. So a way to rectify that is to add more nitrogen materials and to always try and keep an even 50-50 balance between the two.
Great, all right, but what if I have a different problem? What if my compost is really stinky and smelly?
So a smelly compost is usually an indication of the opposite problem, too many nitrogen materials. So a way to rectify that is to add more carbon to the mix and stir it through. And that stirring is really important because it adds oxygen to the mix, which will also help alleviate the smells. So if you stir your compost every couple of weeks, have a nice even mix of nitrogen and carbon materials, your compost shouldn't smell bad.
Too easy, all right. Should I be worried if there's insects or bugs in my compost?
I wouldn't worry too much. They're going to be attracted to your compost the same way the worms and the microbes are that we want in there. They can be annoying if they fly into your face when you take the lid off the top. Way to avoid that is to always have a nice level of carbon on the top so the bugs can't get to the nitrogen bit that they're after.
Great, all right. So while we're talking about uninvited guests, is there a way to prevent rats, rodents and possums from getting into my black bin compost?
There certainly is. So your black bin has a lid on the top, but it's open at the bottom so that worms can move from the earth up into your compost. Easy way to exclude unwanted guests like rats, cats, possums is to put some wire over that hole at the bottom. So you want the holes in the wire to be small enough that rats and mice can't get through, but big enough so the worms can keep moving in and out. So Avery wire is a great size, but anything about that size will do the trick. Fold it around the bottom of the bin so that you can easily take it off when you need to.
Great, that sounds really easy. Thanks so much, Ryan. All right, so now we're going to talk about worm farms. This is a pretty common style of worm farm that you can find around Canberra. It's just got a couple of layers here, and you can see that each layer has holes, so the worms are actually traveling up and down between them. This is the lid of the worm farm. The really interesting thing about this lid is that it has holes here. So worms breathe oxygen just like us, so anything that you keep your worms in needs to have breathing holes in it. So the next thing that we have in our worm farm is a worm blanket. It's not really for the worms getting cold as much as for them needing to stay nice and moist. So this is hessian. You can pretty much use anything like cotton or rag or whatever for your worm blanket, but you just need to make sure that it's nice and moist and keeps your worms nice and moist as well. So with our worm farm, we've got two layers. We've got a feeding layer and a bedding layer. So you always feed your worm farm on the top. This is where we put the food, and this is where the worms come up to eat it. But they can go down to the bottom layer if there's anything that they don't like to eat or that disagrees with them. They've got somewhere safe to retreat to. So Ryan, let's talk about what kind of things worms can eat.
Yeah, so worms like to eat your fruit and veggie scraps, pretty much. If we think of them as vegetarians, then we're pretty much on a safe track, right? Because they don't like to eat meat. they don't like to eat dairy, and there are some vegetables they don't like to eat, right?
That's right. So worms don't like anything acidic, so you should avoid feeding them garlic or onion peel, and also avoid feeding them any citrus. So just stick to like nice plain salads. Think of your worms as slightly fussy eaters, and you'll be all right.
And you want to add some carbon materials too, right? So they want to eat some shredded paper, maybe some ripped up cardboard.
That's right. Yeah, worms like a balanced diet, just like us. The other thing that we need to do when we're feeding our worms is chop up the pieces nice and small. Worms have tiny little mouths, so the smaller you can make those pieces of scraps that you're feeding them, the better it is for the worms. Now you can see here I haven't got very much food in the worm farm, so I'm just going to wait for the worms to eat this before I feed them anymore. It's pretty much like you've got a dog, right, Ryan?
I do have a dog.
Would you feed everything that your dog needs to eat to him on the first day of the month?
No, if I did, I reckon he'd have a crack at it and get a bellyache, but instead I feed him every day.
And it's the same with a worm farm. It's kind of like having a pet. You've got to keep an eye on it, feed it when it needs it. Probably not every day, but every week or so, and then it'll be right. Won't get a bellyache. Yeah. So let's just have a little look down the bottom. So this is what we talk about when we say this is the worm's sleeping area. And let's just talk about the bedding that the worms have. So most worm farms will come with a brick of what we call coir peat, which is just dehydrated coconut fibres. It's a waste product and it's fantastic for worms.
And what's this bit down the bottom, Zoe? I noticed there's a tap at the front here.
Yeah, so this bottom bit is the worms don't live down there. It's just a reservoir, and all the liquid from the worm farm drains down, and then you can use the tap to get out this wonderful liquid that we call worm wee, which is a fertiliser, like a liquid fertiliser that you can put on your garden.
Yeah, it's got to be the best organic fertiliser around, I reckon.
That's right. So we just dilute it in a watering can, so dilute it to be the colour of kind of weak tea, and then you can put it anywhere on your veggie garden at all.
So Zoe, why would the worms in my worm farm be dying?
So there's a couple of reasons for that, but the most common ones in Canberra is either that they're getting too hot in summer or too cold in winter. So as you know, we have pretty extreme weather here in Canberra with our 4 seasons, and you need to make sure that your worms are protected from the elements. So worms don't like it above about 30 degrees and below about 15 degrees. They're kind of like us. So make sure that your worm farm is protected from the worst of the heat by keeping it in the shade, by keeping it in a sheltered position, potentially even in a carport or a garage or a laundry if you have somewhere out of the way. That's a great way to protect your worms from the elements. And also make sure that they don't get too cold in winter. So it's sort of along the same lines. You make sure you keep them on a balcony or even cover them with some hessian or an old blanket to help keep them a little bit more insulated.
Got it. So keep them warm in winter, cool in summer. What about if the worms aren't eating the food that I'm feeding them?
Well, it might be an indication that you're feeding them too much. So if I'd had a lot of food scraps on the top of my worm farm that weren't being eaten, I'd clear them all away and start again with just a very small amount of finely chopped fruit or vegetable matter for them to start with, and only feed them again once they'd consumed what was there.
Okay. Well, I like to keep my worm farm inside, but it's gotten quite smelly. What can I do about that?
Okay, so smelly is an indication that potentially you need to check down the bottom and drain the liquid out of the bottom. Often it's the liquid that runs through the worm farm that's actually causing the smell. Another thing I'd check is that they've got enough carbon. So worms need carbon just like a compost bin does. So any of those dry materials like straw or dry leaves or shredded paper are going to help keep your worm farm in balance.
Great. Thanks, Zoe.
Thanks, Ryan.
What we have here is some finished compost that used to be kitchen scraps and garden waste and has decomposed into this beautiful nutrient-rich soil. Veggie gardens and fruit trees love compost, so I'm going to spread some under here. And along with the diluted worm wee, it's all the fertiliser that your garden will need.
If you enjoyed this video or you want to know more, you can visit our website, canberraenvironment.org, where we have lots of information about composting and worm farming in Canberra, or get in touch because we love answering questions about this stuff.
Thanks so much for watching.